Good evening. On behalf of Gill Books, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of Under the Rainbow by Shane Kenny. I'd just like to say a couple of very quick thank yous. I'd just like to thank Stephen and all his staff here at Hodges. They've just recently revamped the whole store. It's looking absolutely amazing. I hope you all get to wander around and see the superb range that they have always had here and get to see the new nooks and crannies of it all. This book it comes via someone I'd just like to pay particular attention to. It comes via Jonathan Williams. I was fortunate enough to be one of Jonathan's final students in my MA in Literature and Publishing class in Galway years back, and it still kind of blows my mind that manuscripts are now arriving into my inbox, having sat in that classroom. But he's a superb agent who just anything that comes via Jonathan commands respect. So when this email arrived, I knew it would require attention and immediately caught that for me. So that leads me to Shane. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you on this book, Shane, from the very first conversation, which was a long conversation and a very enjoyable one, and we've had nothing but enjoyable conversations since. So it's been my pleasure to both work with the two of you, but on such an important topic also. And now to do the formal honours of launching the book, I'm delighted to welcome Nora Owen to the mic. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We used to say, that we were getting older when the guards began to look like teenagers. Look at the age of this young man, and I really do begin to feel that I've been around too long. I want to welcome you all here this evening, and particularly it's wonderful to see so many of former colleagues of mine from Dáil and from Shannon and from people I met over the years, and to see us all still standing and alive and being able to be here this evening for the launch of this book. When Shane rang me, he rang me to talk about the book, the book he was writing, and then he rang and invited me to the launch. And then a little time passed, and then another call came, and he said, by the way, maybe you would launch it. So for those of you who feel they might be better launching this book, my apologies. I see one man standing there in the middle, Daglon de Bradoon, who every single day of the talks in Northern Ireland, he was there. No matter what was going on, Daglon was there in the rain, the snow, the sunshine. So I'm delighted to see you here, Daglon, and being able to be part of this launch. This book is it's a scholarly, meticulous account of a unique period of government from 1994 to 1997. And why do I use that word unique? It was the first three-party coalition with Fine Gael, Labour and the Democratic Left. And it was the first government, I think, in my history, that was formed without an election. So I went home on a Wednesday evening, as did John Bruton and many others, some in the room here, went home on a Wednesday evening as a backbencher or a frontbencher in opposition, and came in on the Thursday, and I stood up in the Dáil on Thursday and had the great honour to nominate John Bruton as Taoiseach. I was shocked with the change. I can imagine John's kind of sense of an earth-shattering moment when he suddenly finds himself one day the leader of the opposition and the next day the Taoiseach. No election, no fuss, no debates, none of the stuff we're going to have for the next 22 days or so. There he was, elected as Taoiseach, and Dick Spring and Prunchius de Rossa alongside him. And it was a great honour for John to become Taoiseach. He had long years of experience in the Dáil and the Senate and in all sorts of political areas, and it would have been a travesty, that's the way I feel, if he had never made it into the Taoiseach's office. He was absolutely terrific. This book started its life at the end of 1997 when the government changed, and Shane wrote about 40,000 words, he told me, around that time from his notes. He had notebooks, he had tapes, he had scraps of paper, the back of receipts, those little funny notebooks you get in the hotel beside the bed that we all steal because we think it might be useful sometime, and we find it in the back of a suitcase after about 10 holidays. And he had all this, and he wrote about 40,000 of the words. And then for some reason he left it for about 26 years and came back to it. You know, that's quite a long gap. But Shane, as I say, had the notebooks. But any of you who worked with John, and particularly Finola and his daughter here, Mary Elizabeth, will know that John was an avid writer in school copybooks. Remember those of you who remember him? Everything John wrote, everything John heard, a new idea, might have met somebody on the street, Richard might have come in and said to him, do you know what we should try and do? Into the notebook it would go. So I'm sure those notebooks were a great help to Shane when he was gathering the facts of this book. And I know that was, you know, a job. You see, most of us think a government press secretary just stands around looking pretty and nice and intelligent beside a leader or a minister when something's being launched. But of course, any of you here who have been a government press secretary will know it's a great deal more. So Shane was pretty well involved in everything. And what a lot of people mightn't know is that in January of 1994, John Bruton approached him and asked him, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but it's in the book, approached Shane and asked him to become the press secretary for Fine Gael. And Shane said no. And 12 months later, or approximately 12 months later, in December 1994, John approached him to become government press secretary. And thankfully for us, he said yes. So he brought with him, he literally, the day before we were in government, he was presenting News at One. Now, those of you who don't need this introduction, but Shane was the founder of the Morning Ireland report on News at One, 7 Days, investigative journalist in all sorts of things. So he kind of seamlessly moved from recording and interviewing Albert Reynolds and John Major and all those, Dick Spring, and then the next day he moved like seamlessly across into being government press secretary. And it must have been a very interesting time for him because he carried with him the knowledge he had. And he said to me, Nora, one of the main features of writing this book, he said, is to dispel the myth that the Good Friday Agreement arrived somehow miraculously at Easter time, Good Friday in 1998. He said there were at least 6 pillars in his view that led to that, and I'm quickly going to outline them for you. There was the dialogue that had started between Hume and Adams. There was the Downing Street Declaration that Major, Reynolds and Spring had signed in 93. Then there was the IRA ceasefire in 1994. And then Bruton took over, and Bruton and Major were, and remember at that time Major was totally dependent on the Unionist votes in the House of Commons. He had a very shaky government. They then brought out the Joint Framework Document in 1995. Then the decommissioning body was set up with George Mitchell and Harry Hulkery and John de Chastelain. And then in June 1996, the talks were set up eventually with George Mitchell as chair. And Shane saw those as crucial steps along the way. And I was reminded when I was reading it, and I wondered if Shane had thought the same thing. I was reminded, if you'll forgive me for saying that I was reminded of Michael Collins and the stepping stone speech in the Dáil when he came back with the treaty. And I thought, I wondered, did Shane think that? And he did, because on page 368, he said, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness now faced their Michael Collins moment. This is way back at the Good Friday Agreement, supporting an agreement that could potentially in time be a stepping stone to a united Ireland. So Shane saw the same link that I was seeing as he outlined all these different ways that led to the Good Friday Agreement. He also mentioned, which was an important speech, those of you I see here from Foreign Affairs and that, Peter Brook's speech in 1990, where he declared rather courageously that Great Britain had no strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And that was saying to them in Northern Ireland, you know, someday you'll have to look after yourselves. We mightn't want you all the time to be attached to us. I also think that the New Ireland Forum, established by Garret Fitzgerald in 1983, and the Anglo-Irish Agreement before that and the Sunningdale, they were all steps along the way. Mitchell in his book said that Ahern and Blair had the opportunity to enter the history books as the men who brought peace to Northern Ireland. But he went on to say, They owed that opportunity to their predecessors who had begun the process and kept it going. And I have to say that is often forgotten. And having been part of those talks myself, I sometimes used to contradict people when they said, great to get the Good Friday Agreement. I said, yes, but we were working away solidly long before that. I likened it to setting the table. We set up the table, we put the chairs around the table, we even put the cutlery on, and we got past the starter. And we were waiting for somebody to continue on and get the main course into it, and then followed by the dessert. And that's what happened in 1998. It went along like that. And I often recount that up in Castle Buildings, we all ate in the one canteen, and the men used the same toilets and the women used the same toilets. There weren't that many women up there, but the men used, and I saw a recent story where there was talk about Trimble and Adams exchanging words in the men's toilets. But if you think about what that kind of was doing to people, they had to face each other as fellow human beings instead of the enemy over there or the person they wanted to get at. So that was going on all the time. Shane, in his book, absolutely recognises the personal commitment from Bruton and Spring and De Rossa and a number of the ministers, which he very kindly mentions in his book. But he also praised the great dedication and tenacity of officials, extraordinary patience of them and of George Mitchell that led through the talks. And those of you who've been following the recent remembrances will know that some of the officials who were involved in 1921, their names were completely forgotten for years and years, but now they're out now in the open, and their families can recognise the role they played at that time. Shane outlines very, very detailed the major and Bruton discussions that went on to get George Mitchell first to chair the decommissioning talks and then to chair the actual talks themselves. And George Mitchell was in America when all this was going on. When he reads this book, he'll die with embarrassment because he had no idea of the agitation, the anger, the nastiness that was going on behind the scenes in trying to get the talks going. He arrived over shortly before the 10th of June when the table was set, ready with the cutlery on it. And he came over and suddenly realised that there was an awful lot of anger because he thought he was coming in June and he'd be home for Christmas. 22 months later he got home. And through that time, and those of you when you read this book, you'll see nothing stops just because these talks were getting going. Major and Bruton were facing their own problems every day. And one little story came out of the book when there was a discussion. They wouldn't sit down at the table and they were giving out. And Major and Bruton went out to the porter cabin. I mean, the facilities up in Castle Building were not great. Out to the porter cabin to discuss what we thought would be more, how will we get them sitting around the table. But Major immediately broke into an angry speech about the treatment of Great Britain and the BSE because he hadn't got his way in Europe and he was very angry. And the whole discussion was about BSE, not about the talks that were going on where Spring and Mayhew were trying to get them up and going. So that was going on. And it kind of gives you an idea that nothing stops even when you're doing something as important as trying to get a peaceful settlement in Northern Ireland. Shane I picked a few stories because I don't want to go on too long. I picked out a few stories. He reminded us of the strong links with the USA. Now, I'm fingers everything crossed with the change of government will be in January, whether this will continue. But in 1983, those of you might not know that Tip O'Neill, the then Speaker, hadn't a great relationship with Ronald Reagan, a fellow Irish American. So Tip decided to call a lunch on St. Patrick's Day. And he invited Ronald Reagan, no press, and they sat down. And Tip said, I'm going to cook you, I think, a brisket of beef or something very nice and tasty. And Reagan said, well, I'll have to brush up on my Irish jokes. And the relationship grew from there. And that was the first St. Patrick's Day lunch. Now, I think there'd been one back in the 1800s, but this was the first. And the following year, 1984, Shane, with his other hat, his media hat on, was there at that speech in 1984 and at that the lunch then. And having been, or just before that lunch, he went to the top 100 awards for the Irish Americans who had done great things for Ireland. And the person getting the award was Jean Kennedy Smith. And it was a glittering occasion. There was even Marlon Brando there, something I didn't know, that he had Irish ancestry, and Newt Gingrich and all the heads of all the big firms. And Waterford Crystal had made a beautiful dove of peace. I bet no door remembers this. A beautiful dove of peace to be presented to Jean Kennedy Smith. And there was great excitement and everybody crowded onto the podium. And somebody knocked it down and it smashed. Now Shane did not name the person whose shoulder knocked it down, so he's been kept hidden from history. It fell on the ground, broke into smithereens, and the poor official from the Waterford Crystal, who had an apartment in New York, raced over to his apartment to get a piece of crystal from his own collection and brought it back so they could make a presentation to Jean Kennedy Smith. But the whole thing was shambolic, and it was in the Tavern on the Green, those of you who know that, and people kind of disappeared after that. Another story that Shane related in it, I mean, the talks process was a very fraught. I mean, there was boredom, there was hanging around, there was lots of sort of chatting in the room about everything. Whilst one crowd was looking at a document and the other crowd was objecting to the document. And Mr. Paisley was very much present, and there was no everywhere he went. And when we were coming near to getting agreement that Mitchell might get to chair the talks, we were in the room waiting for the whole thing to start, and the table again had been set up, and there was George Mitchell's chair and Harry Holkery and de Chastelaine. And the next thing, one of the officials realised that there was a takeover happening, and Paisley was trying to get one of his hostile people to sit in George Mitchell's chair so he wouldn't be able to take it when he came in. So Michael Ancram, the then minister, raced over, got some poor, again unnamed, and I wonder where he is now, some unnamed junior official, sat him down in the chair and said, "Don't you move until George Mitchell comes in here." And that's exactly what happened. He sat in the chair until George Mitchell was literally on his shoulder and said, "Excuse me, I think this is my chair." And the young lad got up and said, "Yes, I was keeping it here for you because they were trying to take it over." And you know, when you think about that human stuff that was going on all the time there, Shane didn't put a gloss in this book, and you will read the stories of the problems of that Rainbow government, the Phil Hogan saga. God knows Phil Hogan leaking out the budget. Sure, we all knew every detail of the budget before this year's budget. Nobody lost the head or anything. There was the Phil Hogan, there was the Hugh Coveney problem, there was the hepatitis C, there was the setting up of the McCracken Tribunal. So they're all covered in the book, so you can remind yourself what went on there. Shane was very proud of being part of that government, and he thought it was a very good government, very prudent, and he wasn't afraid to say that we shouldn't have gone for election in June 1997. He felt we should have gone on, and that if that government had gone on to the winter, we would have probably got re-elected. But that was the way it happened. He decided that he had to go along with the party, John, and they all decided that they were going to do that. So I just want to finish by saying to Finola, when you hear about the wonderful work, Finola Bruton is here to hear the wonderful work of John. I'm just so sad that he's not here himself, but I know he's up there with one of the notebooks writing a lot of this down and making sure we don't leave anything important out. We feel that for 2.5 years of government, a great deal of good work was done, and I'm glad to have been part of it, and I see other ex-ministers here as well. And it's a proud moment for me to be able to launch this book on behalf of Shane. I want to thank Gills for, as Patrick said, for taking on the task to do this. It is a masterly read, and it's the kind of book you can pick up and put down again, and then go and maybe look at the index and pick out a chapter. I'd be interested to know what happened there. You know, I'm not saying don't read it from cover to cover, but you can dip in and out, or you can give it to a friend and say, just read chapter 15 or chapter 3 and you'll really enjoy it. So I want to congratulate Shane on a work really well done. And I want to say this, I started off by saying this was about a unique time in government. This launch is happening at, again, two unique times. The re-election of a man in America that we will say as little as possible about at the moment, and also the day a new election has been called. And when Shane, in 10 years' time, is trying to remember, when did I launch this book, he'll have no difficulty in remembering. It was the week Trump got elected, and it was the week Simon Harris or Michael D. Higgins called the next election. So enjoy, buy it for a Christmas present, I hope that everybody will. Well done to Gil and well done to Shane. Thank you very much. Over here. Lovely.
Thanks, Laura. I'd now like to welcome Finola up to say a few words. So put your hands together, Finola, briefly.
Thank you, Nora. You certainly brought us all back down memory lane and made us realise we're a little higher up on the escalator than we thought we were. Well, when I read your book, Shane, I read it on the iPhone, and I got so engrossed in it that I didn't even want to stop to sort of change onto the tablet or the computer. And one of the things that struck me was, because I'd really almost forgotten just how all-consuming Northern Ireland was in those years. As I read and read, I said, my God, was it really like this? And because things have changed, thankfully, somewhat now. And I know that many of you, including you too, Shane, and many others that are here, were always worried about John going off script. But, yes. And you all know John's views on Northern Ireland and on Europe. But I think that no script, however well prepared, could really capture what was in John's soul and how he felt about violence and about Northern Ireland and indeed about Europe. It was all complete anathema to him. Now, it's true that some of John's speeches could be demanding, but I think what he was doing in those speeches is that he was challenging the consensus that had arisen in this country over many years. And he was challenging the romanticism and the sentimentalism, not just of people in this country, but of people in the USA. And I think he would have made no apology for that, because what's the point in being in politics if you're not going to be able to stand up for what you really believe in and push an agenda that is really close to your heart. All I would say in conclusion is that I remember on one occasion, many years after John had retired from politics, and I said to him, do you ever miss politics? And he simply said, no, I don't miss being in the Dáil, I don't miss being a minister, and I certainly don't miss party meetings, but I do miss the clinics. And I think that really probably sums John up in a nutshell. It's a terrific read, Shane, and thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you.